Okay, we're continuing in the book of Acts. He is on his third missionary journey, and what a journey it's been. It's incredible. I'd like to open with this intro. Great leaders never stop planning for the future. They dream on a grand scale, look further than their peers, and imagine possibilities no one else thinks reasonable. A great dream can sustain a leader for decades. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. It was for the freedom of his people. They were freed in 1865, but in many parts of the country still in bondage. You know, that's true of many people. Even when they become free, their mental attitude don't realize they're free and they remain in bondage. But in this case, it was true. Paul had a dream. Paul imagined himself carrying the gospel to the vast stretches to the frontier west of Rome, even so as far as Spain. Romans 15:24. And Spain was part of the Roman Empire. In fact, it was a flourishing country in Paul's days, so he wanted to be there. It was an outrageous ambition. He endured hunger, thirst, exposure, slander, rejection, beatings, imprisonment, and stonings. That's enough. In his effort to evangelize present-day Turkey and Greece. But the landmass he envisioned in the West more than tripled the area we had covered thus far on his third missionary journey. So he wisely kept to himself, revealing only what he planned to do in the coming months. While great leaders chart their course far in advance, they also keep a close eye on the ground in front of them. Psalms 119:05 is one of my favorite verses in the Bible, because it says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." The Word of God tells you where you are if you listen. It also will show you where you're going if you're listening. Paul saw the work coming to a close in Ephesus. He would soon turn the ministry to someone capable and trustworthy before setting out on his next journey. Paul sent assistants ahead of him, and Luke doesn't say why Paul stayed, but likely the Holy Spirit guided his choice to remain a little longer in Asia. As it turned out, he would need to see them through a crisis, which we're going to see right now, that had been building up for months. So with that, let's jump into chapter 19, verses 21 to 23. When these things were accomplished, the things that Ron talked about last week, all the miracles that were happening and all the books that were burned, Paul purposed in the Spirit. I love that phrase. Paul purposed in the Spirit. That's how we should all purpose. When he passed through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, "After I have been there, I must also see Rome." So he sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a while. He intended to follow the course he had taken on his second missionary journey so he could strengthen the churches in Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea and Corinth. Let me just say this. Paul established 14 churches that we know of, but there are many other churches that sprouted up from the churches that he established. That's why he talks about churches. And even though the Bible, the New Testament, wasn't put together until years later, Paul's letters circulated throughout these churches, so they all knew what everybody knew about the growth of the church. He also wanted to visit Jerusalem, likely for the last time before setting out for Rome. To get a head start on a ministry to Macedonia, Paul sent 2 trusted assistants, Timothy and Erastus, which was a very common name among freed slaves, who no longer wished to be called by a number. That's how they called slaves in that day. Sometimes they had a tag nickname going along with the number, but to keep them straight, there were so many, they were numbered. Erastus means, does anyone know what it means? It means beloved. Isn't that a wonderful name? You know, I've heard a lot of wonderful Bible names. Have you ever heard of anyone named Erastus? I haven't either. But it's a good name. Maybe they should. Every business revolves around money. Verse 23. After he had spent some time there, he departed and went over to the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order to strengthen all the disciples. I want to make sure I'm on the right track here. Yeah. Have you ever heard the phrase, I would do that for love or money? That's 2 of the highest motivators. And if you wouldn't do it for love or money, you wouldn't do it at all. Now, I heard Rick Warren say one time, and it's always stuck with me, for a successful country, to be a successful country, it needs 3 things. And he called it the 3-legged stool. It needs government, it needs business, and it needs strong families. Those 3 things. And if they're missing one of the 3, it's a 2-legged stool. You know what happens to a 2-legged stool? They go down. And we've seen that, all 3 things. Paul's ministry had undermined the cult economy of Ephesus and stirred up a great big commotion that could have reached as far as Rome. And the last thing anyone wanted was for Rome to get involved. The Christian movement was first called the Way, as we know. It comes from Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And believers first called Christians at Antioch, if you remember, in Acts chapter 11. Because of Paul, Ephesians were turning away from the occult in large enough numbers to affect the local economy. By the way, the devil needs money. He needs an economy. God doesn't need any money. He has all the money, but the devil needs money. So he has to use people to raise money for his movement. And if he doesn't raise money, like I said, he's out of business. Luke noted earlier that the burned books alone exceeded the value of 50,000 silver coins. In addition, people stopped buying trinkets from the magic shops. They were good luck charms, I guess you would say, and stopped seeking the help of mediums, and stopped asking help from the priest in the temple of Artemis, and stopped bringing money to bribe the gods. Now, let me say something about that, and I don't mean to pick on the Catholic Church, but people pay a lot of money to priests to pray their friends, relatives out of purgatory. A lot of money. It's all wasted. When they're there, they're not going to get out. And worse yet, they told tourists and neighbors that Artemis had no power and in fact did not exist. That wasn't a good thing for their economy either. When Demetrius, a local craftsman, you've heard this story many times, livelihood began to dry up. When Paul came to town, he began to organize the merchants to protest the new religion. The issue was money. He didn't object to the way. He didn't dispute the existence of God or even defend the reality of Artemis. As a good businessman, he saw disaster coming for his trade and for the city itself. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it drew thousands from all over the empire. Demetrius did not start a religious riot, he sparked an economic panic. By the way, we've seen economic panic many times before, and a lot of them wouldn't be nearly as bad as they are or were if there wasn't a panic. By people panicking, they don't do rational things. Even like the 08-09 crisis that we had, which we say is the worst depression since the 29 through 32 depression. It was bad, but it got so much worse because everybody panicked. When you attack someone's God or money, verses 28 through 31. Gotta find my place. Now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's traveling companions. And when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. He would have got torn up. And some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him, pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Jesus said, "You cannot serve God and mammon." Now, mammon does not just mean money, it means wealth. It means all of your possessions. In Matthew 6:24, he said, "You cannot serve God and mammon." They are in total conflict with one another. You cannot serve 2 masters. Although the original instigators of the riot understood their purpose, the majority of the crowd did not know what reason they had come together. 2,000 years later, what has changed? You've seen the newscasters go into a crowd, a mob that are rioting, and they start asking people, "What are you here for?" They have no idea. They're just there either having a good time or trying to stir up more and more and more. Not a lot has changed, you know. The crowd, however, didn't see a distinction between Jews and Christians. They just knew both groups opposed idolatry. Back to the text. So Alexander, who came forward to defend the Jews' position, he accomplished nothing more than whipping the mob into a sustained frenzy. You imagine this, for 2 hours they shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." For what purpose? Who cares? Question, did you know that one of the 7 wonders of today is a 98-foot statue of Jesus in Rio? Anybody know that? Yeah. Anybody been there?
No. I've seen it.
Well, it's a 98-foot statue of Jesus in Rio, called Christ the Redeemer. Now, I can tell you that according to ministers I've read that have been there, it's satanic. Now, you would think a 98-foot statue of Jesus would be the real thing, and that's what they want you to think. But listen to this. Jesus is not a statue. He is a personal God. And when I pray to him, I can see him with spiritual eyes. I can hear him with spiritual ears. I do not need a statue. It's distracting from the person of Jesus. And Jesus himself said, God is a spirit, and you worship him in spirit and in truth. You don't worship a statue. I'm sure that whoever built this meant okay things, but it's not. It's distracting you from the person of Jesus. Wisdom of the mayor of Ephesus, verses 35 through 40. And when the city clerk, by the way, the city clerk is the mayor, had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, the image which fell down from Zeus?" Zeus was one of their two gods, Hermes and Zeus, and supposedly they believe that Artemis fell from Zeus. It wasn't a handmade idol. Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. By the way, Rome sometimes had their governor over a particular area. Sometimes it was just someone that was appointed or elected. But they had their proconsul or their lawyers or their judges in every one of those colonies around the world. Because they were, their goal was to bring peace to the world. And that was their motto for a long time, as you know. But if any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar, for there being no reason which we may give account for this dispute and gathering. Eventually the city clerk, which is a reasonable man, got them quieted down. He was a locally elected official responsible for management of the city, including its business affairs. There is nothing to suggest he was either or even sympathetic to Paul. He just wanted to be able to report to Rome that he had things under control. His speech makes 4 points in favor of quietly going home. Here they are. 1, he countered the assertion that Artemis was made with hands instead of having supernatural origins. He literally said that the goddess Artemis fell from Zeus. Number 2, Rome recognized Ephesus with the official designation guardian of the temple, a great honor from the imperial capital. As long as Rome favored Ephesus with the upkeep and protection of the magnificent temple, people would come to see it and continue to spend their money. Anger Rome with a senseless riot, and we're in trouble. However, and the economy would be sure to suffer. By the way, there's 2 things that Rome wanted. If you did them, you were fine. Keep the peace and keep the money flowing to Rome. Is there anything different today? Isn't that what the government wants? Just keep the peace and keep the money flowing this way. Except it flows in a lot of different places, as we have become to know. Number 3, if you're confident in the truth of your beliefs, then you have no need of violence to defend them. True. Number 4, Gaius and Aristarchus were not guilty of a crime, they just happened to be convenient for the crowd who really wanted Paul. That happens a lot today too. Regardless, they had not robbed, desecrated, damaged, or blasphemed. If they were guilty of a crime, the city had a proconsul supplied by Rome for such an occasion. I had a question for you. Have you ever seen an issue resolved by a mob? And you never will. They're just there to stir up trouble, not to resolve anything. Okay, look, 41, the conclusion of the matter. It says, and when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. After he had dismissed the assembly, you can almost sense the mood of the crowd shift from agitated to outraged to sheepish contentment. Like a child who suddenly discovers that asking politely works better than throwing a tantrum. Now, I didn't learn that until I was probably half grown up, and most do not. Paul continues on to Greece, chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself and embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. And when he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece. A little history that you may know. Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 8 depicts Alexander the Great to the letter as the male goat that moves and conquers the known world in less than 13 years. In fact, that goat moves so fast, they depict him as off the ground, moving that fast. 13 years. He was not a Greek, he was a Macedonian who conquered Greece. By the time of Paul, the apostle, was some 400 years later. Greece was both geographically and culturally much larger and greater than Macedonia. In fact, if you look on a map today, or you compare the two, Macedonia is just this tiny little landlocked country within the whole of Greece. That's why Rome, after defeating Greece at the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC, adopted their language and culture and their gods. That's why they called it the Greco-Roman Empire, because that culture and that economy and that language was so prevalent throughout the whole world. And he did this in less than 13 years. And in fact, if you remember, when Alexander the Great came to Israel, he was going to knock them down like everybody else. The high priest went out to meet Alexander the Great and showed him where he was in the Bible. And he was so moved, he did not touch Israel. Amazing. Okay, back to the Bible here. The crisis and threat of violence and persecution had passed. The church was now safe from significant opposition. As a result, it seems Paul felt confident enough to the sustainability of the church to resume his travel plans and leave them on their own. He summoned the believers in Ephesus, exhorted them to remain faithful, and expressed his confidence in the Spirit to nurture them. Then he boarded a ship bound for Macedonia. I'm going to close with a prayer and a quote from Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce it. He said this: "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you." The only thing I can remember about being saved, because I was 8 years old, I was scared to death. It was during the Second World War, and I was just afraid a bomb was going to come in and take me out. I was restless. I was feared. And once I had trusted Jesus, I had peace. My heart just, it was instantly peace. And that's what that does to us. We all know this song, I know. My faith looks up to thee. My faith looks up to thee, thou Lamb of Calvary, Savior divine. Now hear me while I pray, take all my guilt away. Oh, say, Behold, Levi. Thanks for coming. Hopefully we'll see you next week.